They were pretty happy with the performance of Rishi Sunak. I think there is no doubt he put in a pretty good first showing, certainly in comparison to his predecessor, though, frankly, given Liz Truss's performance at dispatch boxes and even her ability to communicate, it was a pretty low bar to jump over, but he did manage to do so. I think it is a reminder, actually, we're going to see quite competitive exchanges between Sir Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak in the weeks and months to come at PMQs in Parliament. Must be said, Keir Starmer had his own quick-witted lines. I did particularly like this one, that he only ran, this of Rishi Sunak, he only ran in a competitive election. He got trounced by the former Prime Minister, who herself got beaten by a lettuce. That was quite witty. I think, there's a criticism of Rishi Sunak that he didn't necessarily answer all the questions, particularly ones on Suella Braverman. We'll come on to that in a second. And it was a bit like the good old hits of Conservative leaders of the past, whether that was on Jeremy Corbyn or indeed Brexit and the referendum, but it was still very effectively done, and I would suggest it was potentially a score draw in the end between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. Now, let's move on to the news of today, because as always with new governments, there is constant news. First of all, on Suella Braverman, we know Labour are calling for an investigation into all of this. There are reports today that Sir Simon Case, who is the Cabinet Secretary, essentially had briefed the Prime Minister that it wasn't necessarily a terribly good idea for Suella Braverman to take over this post of Home Secretary, given the fact that she seems to have broken the ministerial code last week. She made a mistake, certainly for one she had to apologise for. Now, the Prime Minister made it clear that he felt that she'd made a mistake, but everyone deserves a second chance, and that she's a very capable minister and should be back in that post. I've just come from a briefing with the Prime Minister's spokesperson where it wasn't terribly clear whether they were denying that Sir Simon Case or indeed other officials had essentially said it was a bad idea to reappoint Suella Braverman. This is a story that is essentially Mark going to run and run and run. Labour clearly think they're making hay of it. Yvette Cooper, immediately after PMQs, was asking questions of the government about whether there would be further investigations, or indeed whether we'd find out if an investigation has been carried out. In addition to that, the government have also confirmed in the last couple of minutes that the moratorium on fracking, i.e. that fracking essentially is put on the back burner, is now back in place. Liz Truss had a big vote last week in which she tried to overturn that. In fact, the vote also brought about the downfall of her premiership, but they are reverting back to the 2019 manifesto and the position of Boris Johnson that the fracking for shale gas is essentially now on the back burner. And also the Bloomberg in the last couple of minutes are reporting that the government currently have a £35 billion black hole in the public finances following that mini budget and the chaos that followed, and that they have identified 104 potential cost-saving measures going forward. Now, that figure, interestingly, of 35 billion, is actually lower than it was just a couple of days and weeks ago, and I think it is one of the reasons that they decided to push back this fiscal statement, that our autumn statement, to November, in the hope that the stability in the markets will mean that ultimately that figure may drop somewhat further. So we've got announcements on fracking, we've got ideas about that fiscal statement which has now been delayed to November 17th, and we've got those continued questions about Suella Braverman, which will continue, I think, over the next hours and days. And we get a bit more information on what precisely happened in Downing Street yesterday, because you may remember there was a big gap between the appointment of Dominic Raab and the Foreign Sec as Deputy Prime Minister, James Cleverly as Foreign Secretary, and Suella Braverman as Home Secretary. 30, 45 minutes or so, many people suggesting what was being said in Downing Street to lead to that delay.
And Darren, just to look at the first time these two men, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, have squared up against each other at Prime Minister's Question Time, at least, what did we learn about the attack lines that they are preparing to use against each other?
Well, so from Keir Starmer's point of view, it's perfectly clear, isn't it? I mean, there's going to be some very difficult policy announcements, public spending announcements in the weeks to come. Labour will hone on that, whether it's austerity 2.0, who's been affected, why is it not on the broader shoulders. We'll hear a lot more about windfall taxes or higher taxes on wealthier people rather than on middle and lower income earners. Non-dom status, that is clearly still a sore point for the Chancellor, given the controversy he and his family got involved in earlier on this year. There will be, again, pressure to close that tax. It's not a loophole, but essentially that tax arrangement that is in place. And additionally, we talked about this actually, Tom and I, before PMQs, about this video that surfaced during the summer, i.e. drawing money away from deprived parts of northern England to places in the south. Now, there's a little bit of suggestions about where this statement was made. Rishi Sunak would make the statement, and he did this repeatedly during the summer, that there are deprived parts of the country, not just in the north, but in many areas of the south, and that it's right that everyone gets a fair share of the cake. Though Labour would point out he was making that statement in Tunbridge Wells, and Tunbridge Wells is not known. The royal borough of Tunbridge Wells, the royal town of Tunbridge Wells, is not known for being a deprived part of the United Kingdom. So that argument will be had as well. I think from Rishi Sunak and his attack lines, it will be his association with Jeremy Corbyn when he was in the shadow cabinet, and also his association with trying to thwart Brexit as someone who was trying to bring about a second referendum. As I say, in many ways, Gloria, it is the carousel of politics and political attack lines that frankly was used by both sides, whether Boris Johnson was in Downing Street, Liz Truss, or indeed now Rishi Sunak.